and actually need to start to talk to the Hispanic population in an authentic and engaging and interesting way, which was completely, which felt like, whoa, what just happened, in that point. But I suppose what I got a sort of a real understanding of there was that, you can't build a marketing plan. And I think the same is true in some ways in the UK, in the US, for one consumer group, right? When you look at a brand and the opportunities that brand has, you need to work out by retailer, by occasion, what is it that the brand is offering and what is it that the brand needs to do. And the reality is that an occasion like walking into a Costco and buying 16 bars of Dove is very different to that mindset of like, I just need to stock up on my favorite soap, versus a dollar store where a consumer is going, I'd like a really premium soap and I'm prepared to spend $1 for it. And I want to, it feels like something special. It's a big, someone who's on a lower income who's making careful choices about their money versus a high-end Costco consumer who's just stockpiling. Those are two very different shopping occasions. And I think the same is true with food brands, right? Which is you need to understand the mindset that someone goes shopping in and the occasion you're targeting and how you appeal to that moment. I mean, I'll give you an example of some of the work I'm doing at the moment. So I'm an investor and an advisor to a food brand, dog brand called Denzel's, right? Which is a kind of, I jokingly call them for shorthand, like the innocent of dog treats, right? So lots of personality, big on sustainability, big on flavors. They got kind of very cutesy kind of logo and design. The occasion that someone walks into a Tesco's and buys a thing of dog treats is fundamentally different to the moment where you're in a pub with your dog and they're sitting on the counter is the opportunity to buy some dog treats. How you message the brand in those two moments is quite different, right? One is not about price, right? Right? You're in the pub, you've just bought yourself a pint at whatever pounds, right? If you're in London, 7, if you're outside London, maybe less than 5, right? And you've bought that pint and you're with your dog and you're like, oh, well, let's give the dog, it's a different mindset, right? You want it to be fun. You want it to feel like it's a treat for the dog, right? Whereas you're in a supermarket and you're walking down the dog aisle and you're thinking, I must get some treats for my dog. Oh, which brands are there? What are the pricings? What's the offering, right? Completely different messaging. And I think, actually when brands think about, from a food perspective, human food here, actually how you communicate in a Tesco's versus an independent retailer or versus online, the stories you tell, the product offering you have, I think is actually quite different. And I think there's an opportunity to optimize it for those occasions. And I think that brands, yes, you need to work out what is the knock-knock one thing you're doing, but there are different moments you're having to deliver the knock-knock. The knock-knock on social media is different to the knock-knock at point of sale. It is different to the knock-knock in a consumer event you're organizing.
Linking this back to the brand as a human being, right? Is it's the way, I don't know why, maybe a crass way of saying this, but I think with that brand saying, oh, we're not going to change who we are just for the retailer. It's not about changing who you are. It's how you show up. So it's like the way I'll talk about my Ibiza trip, for example, right? To my nana, who's 85, is very different from the way I'm going to tell it to my mates at the pub. Still me talking, but it's the way you speak in those, as you say, optimized per retailer. And I think I think putting it down it's still showing up as the same brand, but telling the story ever so slightly. I'd love to go into.
And I think that analogy is completely correct, right? Which is, it is possible to be authentic to yourself, to be true to your values, to be true to who you are, right? But a kind of core fundamental, like, what are the things you care about? What are your red lines in the way that you interact with both strangers and close friends? And the values should be the same, but you'll behave differently to someone you've met the first time than someone you've known since you were 10, right? And actually, but they can both be the same person. They both have the same authenticity.
Let's talk about marketing. I mean, I wasn't even expecting us to go down these rabbit holes, so this is super enjoyable. So let's talk about marketing plans by retailer. And I think some of the big lessons you've taken from Unilever that are applicable to challenger brands, granted it is more complicated.
In the States, yeah.
Yeah, in the sense. But what are some of the lessons? Say someone's listening to this, they've got to go in and do a Waitrose marketing plan or a brand plan. What do you think are some of the principles of a great marketing plan?
So I think the first thing to say is that the retailers are different, right? And while there are certain truisms like basically everyone shops at Tesco's and pretty much everyone shops at the big retailers at some point, the core consumer group that is at different retailers and the core consumer group that that retailer is targeting are different, right? Understanding your retailer, what their mission is, what they're about, and who they're targeting and how you fit into that story, right, is critical. Most buyers, I would say, want more insight into their category. And while lots of retailers have lots of big data on purchase behavior in store or, what's happening at the kind of top level, they might not understand the dynamics of what's actually happening within their category, right? So how are people shopping for that category in different retailers? What are the attitudes and the drivers of that category, right? So you as a brand owner, as a category expert, will probably and should know more about that category, the buyers that are turning up, the dynamics, the future trends, the interesting stuff that's there. Helping the buyer see how they can win in their category is the basis of that conversation. And then coming up with marketing tactics that will help you win with with that retailer is critical. The one caveat I would give is, I think without being cynical about this, one needs to remember that marketing in retailers is a profit center. Right?
Profit center.
They make money out of it, right? So in the end, do retailers make money out of milk? Not so much. Do they make money when you put an advert in, when they, put a whole bunch of shelf markers up or run advertising on, their TV network or advertise through their database? They make money out of that, right? So they want money from their suppliers to support their categories. So you have to be careful and make sure that what you're picking from the portfolio of offerings that come from the retailer are going to work, I'll say. But look, for me, the big lesson is that you've got to understand your retailer. You've got to then make sure that you're tailoring the mix to the shopper and the relationship that shopper will have with that category and your brand. If you're a highly established brand and you're trying to drive, large pack size, it's one strategy. If you're an emerging brand entering into a sleepy category that people have been shopping on autopilot for generations, you've got a different challenge.
Tell me the difference between the brand plan and the marketing plan, because I think brands get confused with that. And which one comes first, do you think?
Well, I'll start. So I think the difficulty on that is different people will call different things.
Right. Yeah.
I would start with, what is the strategy, right? What are the 4 or 5 things you're trying to do?
Yeah.
To kind of at a business level, what are the marketing objectives that sit underneath those business objectives?
Yeah.
Right? And how are we going to achieve that? So I always start with the classic question of, what are we trying to achieve, right? And I do think that too often you end up at a channel conversation like, oh, we need to do social media. Why do we need to do social media? Oh, we need to do more kind of outdoor. Why do we do more outdoor? I think the question for brands must be, what are the jobs we need to do? What are the things we're trying to achieve? And then build the plan that achieve those. And one of the things that, anyone who's spent time in big corporations knows, the first thing that gets cut in any conversation is the marketing budget, right? Because it's a variable cost, right? You can't cut the factory, you can't cut the people. So actually it's much easier to kind of go, well, let's just stop that campaign. If your campaigns are built on a solid logic of what is the business objective, what are the marketing objectives to achieve those business objectives, and what are the channels we're going to achieve to ladder up, so to speak, then it's easier to get there. So I believe in starting, and I do quite a lot of work with the brands I work with on brand planning and on actually kind of building marketing plans, right, that come from clear strategies, is you've got to start with those fundamental business objectives. If one of the objectives is win at Tesco's, okay, right, what's the number? What's the objective? How are we going to measure it from a marketing perspective? And then what are we going to do to make that happen? And I think the whole thing for me about measurement and consumer insight is one of the areas that some challenger brands don't spend enough time thinking about. I'm a big believer in really getting close to your consumer and really understanding them.
Getting really close to your consumer and understanding them.
So I think, we were talking as we were grabbing a coffee beforehand about the danger of the kind of the London-centric food scene, right? In the end, yes, it's important to win in London, right? And what is it? 12, 13% of the UK. But actually, you've actually got to win at a Tesco's somewhere
Darlington,
between two towns, right? Or on the outskirts of town. Or Waitrose, in the middle of, name a county, right? Suffolk, right? I think in the end, when you own a brand or running a brand, what's really, really important is that you understand at a granular level, what do consumers think about your product, right? What do they think about your brand? What do they think about your competitive brand? What are their frustrations? And the reality is most brands have social media following. Most brands have databases, but not enough brands are asking questions of those consumers.
What questions should our listeners be asking to get more insight on their consumer base that could actually map upwards to achieve those objectives?
But I think if you start at the objectives and you work down, like if you've got clear marketing objectives, right? Which is,
sorry, when you say marketing objectives, so sorry for sounding like a Luddite here, but so you're basically saying do the brand plan first.
I'm saying do the business strategy first and then ladder that into marketing objectives and then communication objectives and then channel choice. Start at the absolute top of, we are trying to grow. Yeah. Let's say you've got a new innovation. So let's take a brand like Fern and Rosie, another brand I work with.
Perfect example.
So let's say Fern and Rosie want to launch a new variant of jam, right? Or let's say Fern and Rosie want to go into a new retailer, right? What's the financial target? Right, we're trying to achieve X 100,000, X million. How are we going to achieve that? What are we going to do to make that happen? And then you literally work through the line, which is like, what are the tactics from promotions to on-packs to media, to retailer media, to brand collaborations, to social, to deliver that objectives? Too often, I think brands go, okay, as a brand, what do I need? I need to be big on, Instagram and TikTok, and I need to have a website, I need to grow my database. Like, well, hang on, step back. What are we trying to do? Right? What are our actual business objectives? Therefore, what are our marketing objectives that come from those? And then how are we going to achieve those with what channels? And I think, lots of the big corporations are really good at putting in kind of big granular processes that take you through that brand planning cycle. And I do think that brands need to really begin their years. We enter into a new year with, sit down, do a SWOT, work out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are your opportunities, what are your threats? Where are the kind of opportunities for the brand that we want to win in? How are we going to achieve them? What are we going to spend to do it? And what channels do we need to support to make that happen? I think that kind of, that granular, God, it's boring. The brand planning process that you'd have to go through at Unilever was excruciating and it took months, right? But ultimately it gave you the rigor to make sure your plan stood up and you were doing things for the right reason.
It's fascinating how there's when this William Kendall was talking about this, brands go through this gestation period where founders are a bit, most founders are, not all, I want to make a caveat of this, they have this kind of, William called it a gestation period, and this almost scattiness, that ready, fire, rave, you're trying to find the product market fit. So it could be like, a lot of the brands I interview or founders I speak to, their initial idea isn't the idea that makes them famous.
Completely.
So you've got to throw a lot of shit at the wall, basically. The market will give you the feedback, and then you tailor. That works to a point. Mm-hmm. Maybe once you get into weight, that will get you into your Planet Organic, your Selfridges, your Harrods, Waitrose potentially. But then you get to another point, and I always say it's like a brand's like a toddler growing up, right? Mm-hmm. You get to a point where you can't be like that. You've got to sit down and have that rigor, and it is boring, but basic and boring, but it does take you to that next level. I think, to be honest, I'm not great at that bit. That bit of sitting down to do the actual planning, I don't find that interesting. But I think you're so right in terms of brands doing it. In terms of
you talked earlier about asking someone to define creativity. Creativity for me is about defining a framework and then breaking the rules within that framework. And I think that the great I think if someone says, just be creative. Like, so I worked with What If Innovation, right, which was one of the leading innovation consultancies, now part of Accenture. And we used to go in to run brand processes with people like PepsiCo and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and Beiersdorf, all the big corporations, to help their brand people think creatively about a particular challenge. You would always fail in that process if the task up front was not defined well enough. If you were not clear about what are we trying to be creative about, what are the parameters around that process, you didn't have a hope in hell, right? And we used to, they always did a sort of, before any process, right, the first step was pause. In lots of the processes that Unilever had, What If had, and it's like, hey, just stop and think for a second. What are we actually trying to do here? Once you've got that, go nuts, right? But if you're not clear on absolutely what you're trying to create, that rigor, you can't be creative. You have to have that constraint to then do that. And I'm a real, it's funny. It's not one of the things it's what Unilever changed about me. I did 2 degrees in art history. When I arrived at Unilever, I was one of the creative ones, was always on all the brainstorms, always doing all the kind of mad creative thinking, the breaking the rules, building campaigns, like getting Naomi Campbell to wear rubber gloves for a washing up liquid campaign, all sorts of crazy stuff. But, what Unilever taught me was if you don't get the rigor right at the front, God help you. And I think that is, the thing that really changed me, as a kind of a human being, was understanding that need to kind of button things down before you kind of start getting creative.
So know the framework and then break it.
Yeah, break it and push it.
That's ultimately linking this back to chefs, right? Is like the framework of, so Tom gave the example of, I'm going to make a pork chop with potatoes. Mm-hmm. That's the framework.